Now I'm going to be handing over to Heather, who is going to take you through this fascinating history. Whether it's true or not, I don't know.
Oh, there's a little bit of urban legend in there, but most of it's true.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Anyway, here we go. Over to you.
All right, thank you.
Carl. And thanks to City of Sydney Council as well for putting this on. This is fantastic. So yes, I'm Heather from Dark Tales, and I'm going to be taking you through a roam along Glebe Point Road this afternoon, a roam along its history from the first start of it, which you can actually see here. This is a picture by Conrad Martins, who was around in the 1800s, so he was actually around from 1801 to 1878. He painted this. This is one of the first captures in 1840 of what Glebe would have looked like back then. So quite a peaceful, tranquil place by the water. So we're going to start there, and then we're going to move on into a little bit of zesty true crime and finish up with some important urban legends. Okay, so the land on which Glebe currently stands is a real place of transition. I did actually originally call this talk Glebe Place of Transition because it is. It started out as a land grant made to the church by Governor Phillip way back in the 1790s. But prior to that, it was actually a really important Indigenous site. So there was kangaroo plains down on the southern end of Glebe Point Road, where the University Park now currently stands, so rich hunting grounds. And then all across this peninsula there was black wattle trees, wonderful fruit trees that the Indigenous people actually used to come and harvest and feast here. So Glebe has been a place of transition all the time, because there was obviously a bit of headbutting with the church as the church took over this fair peninsula. And I've got some quotes written by people at the time about what Glebe Point may have looked like in that early 1800s and prior to that. We've got John Fletcher, and thanks to St James's website, St James Forest Lodge Church website for this quote. The area seemed like a sort of enchanted forest, with its lofty gums looking as gloomy as black feathers on a hearse. The wild duck and profusely growing geebungs, which are small shrubs with green fruit, and I was trying to find some out there, they've got a native garden out there, and hellfire berries, which are native currants, which I do think are out there, were growing in proliferation. Mary Salmon, writing about the history of Glebe Forest Lodge in 1904, reflected, "Forest Lodge was for many years a thick eucalyptus wood alternating with low scrub, and where wild ducks were plentiful." So these ducks seem to be proliferating, all of the quotes from the area at the time. And I'd like to thank the Glebe Society as well, if there's any members here today, because some of their information has actually helped this contextualising upfront piece in this talk. And they really talked about the sacred nature of this area. And there is actually a remnant of that sacred nature of this area. It's actually in the churchyard in the middle of Glebe. And it's a very old grey ironbark tree, and it was a healing tree. And it was dated to the early 1800s. And it's right in the corner of St John's Anglican Church, so just in that middle bit near the junction with Piermont Bridge Road and St John's Road, the church down there. So, the church benefited from Governor Phillip's generosity. So the chaplain of the First Fleet, who was Richard Johnson, was awarded this 400-acre grant, and Glebe came into being. And it remained covered in bush for quite a few years after that, so a good 30 years. The church started the subdivision of Glebe Peninsula. We've got some maps to show this. So it was initially carved up into 28 plots, and I'll talk you through some of the properties that ended up being built on those plots. So the landed gentry felt that it was a really good place to actually start building their homes, because it was considered that a high land on a peninsula looking out over the water was actually very healthful, because if you can imagine at the time, the centre of Sydney was not very health-giving. So trying to get out of that area was the thing that they wanted to do. So we've got some notable houses, and a lot of them are still here, which is really, really lucky. The first one we've got is the Toxteth Estate. So that was built on this plot, number 27, by George Allen, who was a legal professional and an ex-mayor of Sydney. So he bought the plot in 1829 and built the house in the 1830s, and they also built Tranby on the site as well. That was then known as Toxteth Cottage, and that was built in 1840. So you can see how this plot became the George Allen Estate, which is now St Scholastica's College. Then we move down the road to plot 18, where we have a beautiful building that is a bit hidden from view. It's called Rosebank, and this was built in 1832. And it started out as Glebe Cottage, but then was redeveloped into this 9-bedroom Gothic mansion, which still exists behind the Valhalla Cinema to this day. So we're just down here. And it had a bit of a strange history. It was in private ownership until 1903, and then became the female refuge for fallen and intemperate women. So watch out. There is in a line with the church ownership of the land, there was a lot of refuges and care facilities actually dotted across this site. We have also Lyndhurst. So you see Piermont Bridge Road, you see the Dogleg Bend, and it's around about here, the Lyndhurst Estate. So that was built in 1835. And that was built by James Bowman, who was the Colonial Inspector of Hospitals in 1837. And it was actually scheduled for demolition in the 1970s. There seemed to be a push in the 1960s, 70s and 80s to get rid of anything that was old and architecturally significant, but this got saved. Then we have Rothwell Lodge, and that was built by William Bennington Joyce in 1847. And again, it was set for demolition, so it's right up here. So we've got it just here. It still exists to this day. I've got some pictures on the next slide of what these look like. Another house is not so lucky. It was Avona, and it was actually built on Forsyth Street, which is up here, Avona House, and unfortunately that did get demolished in the 1960s. And on Glebe Point as well, on plot 25, we have two wonderful houses. One exists, one doesn't. The one that exists is called Bellevue. It's the smaller house that the landowner built for his daughter in 1896. William Jarrett was the main builder and the owner of this plot, and he built himself a wonderful mansion called Venetia, but unfortunately that got demolished. So here are these wonderful houses. So St Scholastica's, Rothwell, this is that's Lyndhurst, sorry, Rothwell, Avona, and then we've got the wonderful Venetia that was there. This picture was taken before Bellevue came into existence.
How was that one, particularly the last one, demolished? Was
It may have got into disrepair. It may have been, at the time, there was a lot of heritage that was overlooked. There may have been somebody that wanted to put some industrial complex in there or some flats. It could have been any of those reasons, but there's been a lot of buildings that have been lost over the years, unfortunately.
Freeway.
Is that other one demolished too?
Yes, this one of Owner was demolished as well, but these ones all exist still, which is great. Okay, so this is a bit of background to Glebe's history. So I love this picture because you can see that it's from 1900, and thanks to Sydney City Archive for this, you can see Glebe Point Road really hasn't changed that much on this side. This is where the post office used to be, going down that direction from St John's Road. But you can see a lovely charabanc in the middle, which is great. So Glebe grew quite quickly. From the 1840s, it only had a population of 1,000 people. And it had one pub, which was located where the Nag's Head is today, so just up St John's Road. It became a municipality in 1859, and at that point it had 13 public houses and a population of 3,000. So the public houses were really increasing ahead of the population almost. So in the mid to late 1800s, the subdivision of the lands in Glebe really started up apace. People were pushing out from the city. They wanted places to live that were affordable, so they really started subdividing smaller and smaller. And the Toxteth estate was one of the first estates that was built, and that still retains a lovely Victorian air about it, with wide boulevards, pollarded trees, big houses. But in the southern end, because Glebe is a place of transition, you had the opposite. You had very small terraced houses and industry. So at this time, somebody wrote in the Town and Country Journal in the 1800s about a picture of what Glebe was like around that time. So the early years of Glebe, in the 1840s, houses were very few and far between. The population was not very numerous. The greater portion of land was covered by scrub and wattle trees, which is a bit of a damning indictment, seeing as they were calling it an enchanted forest earlier. And it was occupied by numerous camps of what they call blacks back then. The roads were wretchedly formed, and the lower part of the township was occupied by an impassable swamp. So that's the area down towards the park, the Sydney University Park. But under the fostering care of its aldermen and councillors, it was rapidly developed into one of the most populous and fashionable suburbs of the time. Its distance was only 2 miles from the metropolis, and its character of its scenery was highly picturesque. Its streets were well paved and in good order and in situation, high, dry and healthy, which you could not overlook at the time because we had things like typhoid whizzing around. So some parts of Glebe had more stringent planning controls than others, and we're going to focus on the area down towards Sydney University Park, so this whole southern area of Glebe Point Road now in terms of what happened with planning. So you can see two different approaches here. So on one side you've got one estate, so this is the St Philip's estate. It's on the eastern side, so you've got the side where Cowper Street is, Mitchell Street, going down towards what they call Black Wattle Swamp back there, so sort of Wentworth Park side. So basically it was a free-for-all there. There were small lots allocated, and houses were only built to last for 28 years. They had 28-year leases. And anything went. So there was wooden shacks and all sorts of things. And as you can see from Francis Street in the 1900s, that was still very much the case. But on the other side, where Glebe melds with Forest Lodge, there's a different matter entirely. So by 1856, everybody had become a little bit more ordered in how they subdivided and developed that area. And there was a lot of local builders that got together. There was Elphinstone, Ambrose Thornley, Thomas Triple Smith, which is a mouthful to say the least, and Edmund Blackett, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute. But they all got together and created the Bishopsthorpe estate, which was 99-year leases, no wooden buildings, and a very nice streetscape. And let's talk about Edmund Blackett. So he is quite a luminary in this area. He was the colonial architect and built many different buildings across Sydney. He also built his own family home, which is Bajura, which is on the left-hand side here, and that's at 357 Glebe Point Road, right next door to the Toxteth. So this was a really interesting house because it has what you could call it the extension from hell behind it. Although fans of brutalist architecture, which I am on the fence about, it's a really prime example of 80s brutalist architecture. So Bajura was for many decades this house here, and it was a family home, but then from the 1920s it was into public ownership, and it was central in the child welfare system in New South Wales, and so it became the depot for state children. It included Bajura Orphanage and Glebe Girls' Home, and was later the Metropolitan Girls' Shelter. But it actually closed and went back into government administrative hands in the 1970s, so it became the Department of Family and Community Services then. And then it became the Children's Court, which is when this brutalist building, Bajura, actually was created. And although it's empty and derelict and its future is not known, it does thrive on YouTube. If you type in Bajura, there's a lot of urban explorers that find their way inside it.
Is that next door to this?
Yeah, so it's literally behind it. Yeah, so if you walk around the corner behind the Toxteth, you can actually see this massive, great brutalist building, which still sits there. Must have been terrifying going in there as a child.
What's the current function of this ugly building?
No current function except for urban exploration.
Okay.
So it was a children's court, and then, it must have been terrifying for the poor kids going in there. But then that all got switched around and it's empty, it's waiting for replanning. There's mumblings that it's going to be apartments, there's mumblings that it's going to be pulled down entirely, who knows at this stage. It's all.
So it doesn't belong to anybody? Or is there...
Oh, it belongs to the government.
Oh, it belongs to
Yeah.
When was it abandoned?
Oh gosh. I would say it had just been abandoned when I was living in Glebe, so that would have probably been about 15 years ago, I would say. So it's been languishing ever since. I don't know how they get in, the urban explorers. I really don't. It is literally fortress-like. So from one frightening thing to another, we're going to talk a little bit about the pollution and things that happened in Glebe. So as with all suburbs across Sydney's inner west and beyond, as it grew and it developed, the services weren't really keeping pace, the roads weren't really keeping pace, the sewers weren't really keeping pace, the water supply wasn't really keeping pace. So these pictures are from around Blackwattle Bay at the time, so you can see the industry growing. There was a lot of tanneries, there was grazing, there was abattoirs all around the edge, and not least the Glebe Island abattoir. So you can see Glebe Point here, you've got Pyrmont there, and this is Glebe Island. So this is shortly going to be one of Sydney's newest suburbs, but for years it housed industrial-sized government abattoir before it moved to Homebush in 1915. And so all of this chaos and industry around Blackwattle Bay didn't make it very pleasant to be living in Glebe. So all these people that had bought these lovely big palatial houses with a view to having fresh air actually couldn't open their windows for most of the summer months because of the stink from Blackwattle Bay. So they started petitioning in 1873 to get the abattoir closed down, but it didn't close down until 1915.
Maybe it's in the city. If the abattoir
here is what I need something I'm thinking about. How those animals got transported to.
Oh, they were herding them, literally herding them along Parramatta Road. There was grazing lands all around Parramatta Road. They were herding them up. There was a rail line actually that stopped around about here, and it had a dual function of bringing coal into the power station, White Bay Power Station, but also animals, and then they drove them across a bridge into the Glebe abattoir.
Okay, this whole very filthy industrial area is close, even close to Sydney Uni at that time. No.
Yeah.
It's not quite close, right?
It's quite close to the centre. They needed to transport fresh meat really quickly. There wasn't a massive amount of refrigeration facilities around at the time. I mean, it was all coming in, but yeah, it was really quite hard. So Glebe residents were always complaining from the mid-1800s on about the miasma fever bed of fumes that rose up from Blackwattle Bay and Blackwattle Swamp, which is where Wentworth Park now exists. You had cattle yards, pig yards, tanneries. You had also on the peninsula itself very little drainage. They relied on street culverts. So deep culverts along the sides of the streets, which often became choked up with horse manure and all sorts of rubbish, and literally spread this horrible liquor across the street. So it must have been pretty horrible. And at this time, in the mid to late 1800s, Sydney was rivaling the poorest slums of London in terms of mortality rate. There was typhoid outbreaks. There was a lot of kids dying. The mortality rates were really, really bad. So in the 1870s, the authorities said, right, we've had enough of this, we need to get a sewerage system put in across the inner west. So that hit Glebe in about the 1870s. And in response to complaints, the best thing about researching this topic is seeing letters to the editor from the newspapers at the time. So somebody wrote a letter to the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald in 1884, and he said that until these provisions had been made, the Glebe residents were forced to be without water for 5 to 6 hours a day in the summer months, which was terrible. It would have been awful. So they actually put plumbing in at the same time they did the sewerage system. Did you know that the bubonic plague came to Sydney and came to the inner west? So for a time, there was a cordon all around this area. So again, this poor area of southern Glebe Point Road. This is Parramatta Road. Here you've got Glebe Point Road. It was all around this area here that was cordoned off for to stop the bubonic plague spreading outwards anymore from where it started in Haymarket. All right, so that's a bit of contextualising history. Let's get on to the true crimes. And there are a few. So Toxteth Estate was a very glamorous, very wealthy, well-to-do estate. And you can see a picture of one of the houses on the Toxteth Estate there. You can actually see the Parramatta Road as it turns off into Glebe Point Road back then. And this is another Victorian area, which you can see horse-driven omnibuses. So you get a sense for that kind of, what it would have been like back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So in August 1912, the Sun newspaper reported on a mysterious assault. A night watchman found a man in a lane off Toxteth Street in a badly knocked about condition. Witnesses who came forward revealed that he had been brought from the city to Glebe Point by two strange men in a taxi cab, who then, as soon as they alighted, knocked him about and took from his person 16 shillings, a metal watch and a chain. In October 1925, a 14-year-old girl was bashed over the head in Arcadia Lane. She'd been sent out on an errand. And when she was returning with her purchases, she got hit on the head from behind and sadly was robbed of just 1 shilling. There was repeat offenders, so it was when larrikin gangs were really starting to get a foothold in Sydney in the early 1900s. So turn of the 20th century, it was really, there was a lot of jobless young people, and they started hanging around, and there was a bit of standover happening, so they would try and extort money, they would literally bash and rob people, so there was a lot of that starting up in Glebe. In 1933 in December, a man called Norman Hugh Connolly was aged 26, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for one of many attacks on Toxteth Street. He was described by Detective Sergeant Silcock as one of the lowest types he had ever come into contact with during his 30 years on the force. He was basically bashing ladies and stealing their handbags, so a nice noble enterprise. So I found some pictures as well of accidents that happened in Glebe. So this is literally, you can actually see Broadway behind it. This was a tram accident that happened in the 1940s. And other pictures were from around Sydney at that time as well, but I haven't got a handle on where they were taken. But in January 1903, the Daily Telegraph reported on a Glebe fatality at Toxteth Road, where George Hurst of Waterloo met his death by being thrown on his head while assisting to back a horse into a cart. So it's a bit of a dangerous time there. In May 1949, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that a man had injured himself when he fell from a tram at the northern end of Glebe Point Road with the terminus at Cook Street. He was admitted to hospital, but he did make a recovery. And in 1949 as well, this tram accident happened. It was a major accident on the corner of Glebe Point Road and Broadway. And two trams collided on the corner, and several people got injured. Luckily, nobody died. And on that same corner as well, which was a bit lethal, in 1918, a car actually flipped over on that corner. It tried to take the corner too fast, and cars were built like tanks back then, and so literally flipped over. There are also some strange and troubling crimes that happened in Glebe during this time. And apologies if this is your house. I mean nothing by it. So I triangulated some news articles with census data, and I found an approximation for this. It was a major crime at the time. So in 439 Glebe Point Road in 1922, police were called because they had a tip-off, and they went to a shed at the back of the property and dug away into this lime pit, and they found the body of a woman. This woman was from Coogee, and she'd travelled there apparently to have a procedure done, so it may have been an abortion procedure. But her name was Gertrude Hayden, and she died as a result of that, and instead of calling the authorities, they just popped her in the lime pit and hoped for the best. And next door, this is a crime-ridden neighbourhood, but it looks beautiful. The Daily Telegraph reported a violent assault perpetrated against the landlady Elizabeth Murray by her tenant Henry Langby. Langby accused Murray of opening his mail and gave her a clip on the jaw. Murray pushed him away, but he hit her again. He was fined £7 with £3 costs and ordered to pay £9 compensation, which was actually quite a bit of money back then. Several thousand. A more exciting case, or less gory case, was the site of a massive distillery that was unearthed by police down Glebe Point Road, and it was actually almost opposite where the Toxteth Hotel is today. It was in a private house, and the police reported that it was the most complete industrial level distillery that they'd ever come across. So this was in 1918, and it was right in the middle of the Prohibition period, so these guys were onto a good wicket, distilling illegal grog. And they actually got set £500 bail, which was about $55,000 today, which was no mean sum. It was two men, John Smith and John Douglas, and they were charged with unlawfully manufacturing excisable goods. Let's move down Glebe Point Road. So here's a familiar building at the top, 22 Glebe Point Road. I think it's another restaurant now. It keeps changing hands. But it was actually for a time the home of a lady who practiced palmistry. So I entitled this story, She Didn't See It Coming, because she really didn't and should have done. In 1909, this lady who lived there, Christina Elder, was actually practicing palmistry on a man on actually New Year's Eve, can you believe it? And his name was John Francis Wilson, so she'd invited him into the property, was reading his palm, and that was highly illegal at the time. And he may have been sent by the police, or he may have just not got a reading that he wanted and tipped them off afterwards, but she got arrested. And she not only read his palm, but she actually read his head as well, which is the ancient art of phrenology. So that's now been debunked, I think, now as a technique that, she did both things, in for a penny, in for a pound. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner there the place that is now Bad Manners Cafe and is now Good Manners Cafe again, I think. So this was one of the early pubs in Glebe, when it way back in the 1850s. But it was also then became a store, a general store, and it was owned by a very stout Irish woman called Mrs. O'Regan, who actually crammed about 8 family members into that little area on the first floor. And one night, unfortunately, in 1932, that place caught fire. So a fire broke out downstairs. It was a small goods shop at the time, so selling cooked meats, hams, things like that. And they weren't aware of it until smoke started pouring up the stairs and getting into the apartment. And by that time it was too late to escape, so they were hanging out the windows, working out how to get out. And luckily, a railway employee was just about to start his early morning shift and was cycling past and suddenly saw them waving from the windows, and actually went round the corner to Mitchell Street to the fire brigade and got them to come to the rescue. So luckily the building wasn't harmed, the people weren't harmed, and everything ended well. In the bottom left-hand corner we've got the Ancient Britain pub. So that was it in the late 1800s, and it's had quite a few facelifts, I would say, since then. It was the background to an interesting murder case. It was an alibi that was used by the protagonists in 1882. So this was the alleged murder of a lady called Elizabeth Armstrong. She was found floating face down in the waters of Blackwattle Bay, and this was in September 1882. And I've pieced this together from a number of different articles. The inquest was quite a big affair, and the men that were accused was a man called John Yard, who was a slater, so he was a roofer, and a man called Hamlet Miller, which you don't hear that name very often now. He was a member of the permanent force, so this was a government police force that was put in place at the time, so he should have maybe known better. Apparently they were sitting out near Blackwattle Bay one evening, where they saw the deceased, Elizabeth Armstrong, wading waist deep in the mud at Blackwattle Bay. And they thought it was very strange, because, as we know, it wasn't very nice to be anywhere near that water at the time. They called out to her, and when they called out to her, she turned around and said, "I'm looking for water deep enough to drown myself in." The men said they spent some time trying to get her back to the shore, but eventually they ended up leaving her to her own devices and went to the Ancient Britain, so they said. However, the intrigue deepened because the landlord and the barmaid that were on that night at the Ancient Britain said they never saw them. And other witnesses came forward to say that they'd seen John Yard, the slater, and that woman walking across the paddock to the water earlier in the evening, so the mystery deepens. Elizabeth's husband, John Armstrong, identified the body of his wife, and he told the inquest she was not in the habit of drinking to excess. But he had seen her on one occasion intoxicated, so that could have been a reason for it. But he had no quarrel with her, and she'd expressed no intention to take her own life. Other witnesses came forward to claim that John Yard and Hamlet Miller were actually in a state of drunkenness on that night, and were literally responsible for this woman's death. Yard's wife claimed that a few years prior, her husband, so John Yard the slater, had been confined in a lunatic asylum, probably Tarban Creek, which was Gladesville Asylum, and had times been a little strange, so she said. But despite all these inconsistencies and whatever happened, the jury returned an open verdict, so we don't know. Okay, let's move on to some legends. Hetty and Alfie. And I've got them in silhouette because I've tried to do a lot of digging into them. And it's a little bit tenuous to say the least, but I will fill you in. So directly opposite H.J. Foley Park, so right near the junction with Pyrmont Bridge Road and between opposite the church that we talked about earlier, there's two Italianate twin houses, very nice looking houses. They're 207 and 209 Glebe Point Road. They're privately owned now, but for some years they were various restaurants. They were actually at one time the location of an iconic Sydney restaurant called Hetty and Alfie's. So that piqued my interest. And according to dining out publications such as Broadsheet, which I found an article from it in 2013, the restaurant was named after a notorious standover man, Alfie White, who allegedly ran a speakeasy or a legal bar upstairs at 209. And his neighbour, Hetty Stapleton, who is also known as Miss N. Stapleton, was a locally known chef who lived at 207 at some point in the 1940s. So this is 209, 207 on the other side. I've trawled the census records, I've trawled the Sands Directory as well, all the way through from the 1920s to the 1940s, and I can find that a white family actually occupied 209, so maybe Alfie flew onto the radar because of his nefarious ways. But usually these gangland identities did like to cause a furore and talk about themselves, so it seems a bit strange. But there was a Miss Elizabeth White there in the 1930s, and Laura White was there in the 1940s. So that's kind of ticked off that maybe he was there and living undercover. But Hetty is really hard to find. The O'Neill family had this property on the right-hand side for some years, and I can't find any record of Hetty or a Stapleton or anything, but they may have just been renting a room there. So it's an interesting little urban legend there, because apparently they had a good thing going according to the restaurants that would occupy the place. I don't know if you've walked past 134 Glebe Point Road at any time and just gone, what is that sandstone cellar? Is it some colonial relic that was left over? Well, I can actually fill you in on what it was. So 134 Glebe Point Road, which is the house at the top, so it's just on the corner with St John's Road, was built by Edmund Blackett in the 1850s. And the first person that lived there was a man called William Townley Pinney, who was the president of the Pharmaceutical Society. And he occupied that place for quite a while. And then it was sold to the McQueen family and then the Adie family. And both of those families, strangely, were dentists. And there's still a dentist on the corner of that road even today, which is very bizarre. But Alfred Adie, the patriarch of the household in the 1960s, 1970s, actually had a passion. He wanted to create this cellar-like restaurant. So he actually started digging away and excavating the bank that was under his house in the 1970s and opened up Darling Mills Restaurant a few years later. So that's the history of this place. It's not a colonial vault by any means. It's a man's vanity project from the 1970s, which is really quite strange. Urban myth and urban legend. Well, here's an urban legend. Chow Frederick Hayes. This is him in his 20s, and this is him from a Bill Leake painting that was done for the Archibald Prize in the 1990s that showed him a few months before he died from lung cancer. He was a piece of work, to say the least. He was one of Sydney's most violent standover men, and he aligned himself with Kate Lee in the Razor Gang Wars. So he was literally the enforcer. But before that, he actually grew up around Glebe. And the backstory to this is that Glebe was really quite a violent area in the early part of the 20th century down at that southern end. As I mentioned earlier, there was the larrikin gangs that started gathering on street corners. There was illegal two-up. There was sly grog. There was all of that happening. And there was an article that was a very detailed article about the gangland wars that was happening at the time in Glebe, called The Gangs of Glebe. And there was a lot of beatings that went on. There was also a man that was attacked by a tomahawk, which was very strange. There was a state of lawlessness all throughout that southern area, end of Glebe Point Road, around Greek Street, around Francis Street, around Mitchell Street. And people were scared to go out at night. Even policemen were getting beaten up. There was also a strange affair that I came across in this morass of true crime down here. It was an article called "A Cook Runs Amok." And it was very strange. There was a house just off Glebe Point Road called Durham Court, so it's just on Glebe Lane behind Glebe Point Road. And it was a residential boarding house, and it had a Swedish cook, and I couldn't get beyond that because I love the Muppets. And apparently they had a bit of an argument, the cook and the housekeeper and some other employees there, about the affections of a girl. And so the Swedish cook ran amok and knifed a couple of these other employees, which luckily they did recover, thank goodness. But he was jailed. So he was obviously a passionate man. But going back to these larrikin gangs, police really struggled to keep up with the litany of crimes that was happening in this southern end of Glebe Point Road, which is around Broadway. And in 1914, the Northern Star newspaper covered the story with the Director General of the police actually just choosing to bury his head in the sand and lie about what was actually going on. Because at the time, people were frightened to go out, they couldn't do anything. And he actually said, "These comments have not the slightest foundation in fact." And into this fray came Chow Frederick Hayes, or Frederick Chow Hayes. Chow was his nickname. So he was born in 1911, and his father died at quite a young age, and he ended up living with his mother and his grandmother in Chippendale. And it was not too far from Glebe Point Road, and that's where he cut his teeth running with the larrikin gangs. In 1931, he was remanded on charges of malicious damage, running amok with a shovel at a Glebe dance hall. He attacked dancers and destroyed light bulbs and a chair. By his mid-20s, it was said that he had around 70 warnings and misdemeanours on his criminal record, so he was a really busy man. In 1939, he appeared to have really hit his stride in the crime department. He was operating a full-on standover enterprise with 2 other men. So he was going around to Glebe cafes and bars and, well, bars as much as they existed back then, with threats of violence, trying to extort money from them. And he was fined £5 in 1939 for throwing coffee over a Glebe hamburger shop owner who had refused to serve him and told him to sling his hook. He kept going, and later that same year, 1939, the Tweed Daily reported on a man shot in Glebe. And it was at Telford Street. One night, residents up that street, they reported hearing gunfire. Hayes was in a standoff with another man, and he came off worst. He actually had a bullet hole in his left-hand side, but he was really keen that the police didn't arrest him and find out what went on. So he actually, before the police came, managed to change his shirt somehow. The police came and searched him, but they obviously found the bullet hole because it was literally bleeding everywhere. They took him to hospital in handcuffs, and they interviewed him many times. He refused to say anything, which was the gangland way back then. You just didn't dob anyone in. And all he would say, because it was near Christmas time, was that Father Christmas hit him with a bottle. And he later discharged himself. So he was rampaging around until the 1950s, and he had a score to settle. So he was living in Ultimo in the late 1940s, early 1950s, with his nephew, Danny Simmons, who was a famous boxer, who used to box at the Leichhardt boxing arena. So there's a massive, great 5,000-seater boxing arena in Leichhardt back then. Danny Simmons actually got shot through the window in the back of the head in that house. And police didn't know whether it was people that were targeting Danny because he was a bit of a womanizer, or it was mistaken identity, they were after Chow, his uncle, or any other number of reasons. But he had a score to settle, and he knew, or he felt, that a kingpin called William Bobby Lee was responsible for shooting his nephew. So in a nightclub, which is Ziegfeld's in King Street in Sydney, so no longer exists, I think it's a bank now, he actually sprayed William Bobby Lee with bullets and went to jail, and that was the start of his decline. But he kept going, committing crimes all the way up to the 1990s, almost on his deathbed. So he's nothing if not tenacious. Okay, I'm sure you guys all know this place. Let's return to the Glebe Point. So this is an interesting parkland. It's always had a really transitional air about it, and sometimes an unsettling air about it. It was reclaimed from the ocean, so it used to be Johnston's Creek estuary. And in the late 1800s, it actually got reclaimed, and it turned into Federal Park on the Annandale side in 1902 in gratitude to the Federation. And in 1909, the side that's on Glebe's side was called Jubilee Park to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of Glebe being a municipality. It's got an award winner in it. So this viaduct is the longest viaduct in the whole of the New South Wales transport system to this day. It's 0.5 kilometre long, 2 million bricks. It's an amazingly sturdy thing for being built on estuarine land. So while this area is really pristine and lovely, and there's lovely cricket matches that happen, it's a little bit of a hellmouth. There's been quite a few murders here over the years, and I was trying to wrap my brain around why this was the case. And it could be that it was attracting a transient population for a time, because you had the goods yards, you had this lovely viaduct built, and the goods yards were there. And you also had the tram depot that was built in 1904, so a lot of people congregated around there. So it pulled a lot of strange people in. There was a number of crimes. Starting out in 1918, there was a man that was shot behind the cricket pavilion there. There was a poor, unfortunate vagrant who actually went to sleep overnight in the 1990s in the cricket pavilion there and got bludgeoned to death, and it was one of a number of cases where vagrants were actually getting bludgeoned all across the city, which was really, really tragic. And in the 1970s, it was the site of two murders, two really notable murders. So it was actually on the other side of the viaduct from what you see here. It was actually a place called the Street with No Name, and it's quite an iconic place. If you look on YouTube, you can see lots of videos about it, mainly ghost hunters running around with EMF meters and things, but it had these two murders happen there. Two boys, 12-year-old boys, 6 months apart in the 1970s, were murdered by the same boy who was a resident of Annandale. And the police investigation was huge, and he got arrested about a year later. There's also the case of an alleged satanic murder that happened in this park in the 1980s, but we can't find any records of that at all, so it may have been just part of the satanic panic. So it's a beautiful park, definitely, but underneath, watch out. So it certainly has a vibe. And that brings me to the end of my talk. And I hope you found it really enjoyable. I've got some books for sale here today, if you'd like to have them. Also, if you don't mind filling in the QR code as well to tell me about your experiences here today, that would be great. And I am opening the floor to questions. Yes?
Where did Glebe get its name?
Oh, because it was from the church. So the church lands are the Glebe lands. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, yes, sure.
Is it, sorry, was the demolition of some of those houses you were talking about at the outset, not due to plan freeway that was going to go right down through Glebe and across onto North Street?
That's a good point. Yes, there was a freeway planned. They'd mapped it out. I don't know if they'd started fully demolishing stuff, but yeah, there was. The powers that be wanted an aerial motorway to go all the way to Parramatta from the middle of the city, and all that remains is that bit around Darling Harbour. They didn't get very far with it, so that would have probably been.
And some of those that remain were because the campaign against that was successful. So
yeah, there was the green bans that happened. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else got any questions? No, all out of questions. Oh look, thank you so much. And as I said, I've got a book about Glebe Point Road, I've got a book about King Street, Newtown. I've also got a book about the suburbs that are around the edge of Leichhardt, so Annandale, Balmain, all the true crime history of those places. If anyone's interested, please let me know, and you can purchase one. Thank you.